Hey y'all, just a quick reminder that if you like what I'm doing, subscribing, liking, and commenting are always great ways to help the channel, and sharing with your friends is always appreciated. Now, having said that quick little message, let's get on with the show. Enjoy. The Other Place, an original short story by Charlie C. Thomas. The light had been red for 5 minutes before it changed, but the line of traffic barely had time to pass before it turned red again and left Alan sitting in his car, bouncing his left leg and leaning his face into his fist propped up by the door. After another 2 lights, he finally left the heart of the city to weave through evening traffic for another hour before he left his work behind him for home ahead. He sighed with a smile, slumping into his seat with one hand on the wheel, weight of the week already sloughing away as he melted into the seat. Then, like a random childhood memory, the other place crept up from the back of his mind. He hadn't gone all week, trying to ration his visits with how easy it was to lose himself there. But a week was long enough, wasn't it? He set his jaw with a determined look and nodded, the nervous jitter in his leg gone as he readied his mind and pictured it behind his eyes. The other place. The town cast in perpetual sunset with long, warm shadows fixed in place on the ground like paint. The empty roads, the flickering traffic light, town hall amid the green fields surrounded by its roundabout and the businesses in the town center. The tailor shops, knick-knack stores, diners, gas stations on the edge of town, the old houses and farmland to one side with suburb on the other. He pulled his car to the right, taking a side street as he opened his eyes and pictured the sky. The sapphire and black just off-center with warm light on the horizon all around, and the orange-gold sun filtering through the trees and between brick buildings. He breathed and slumped in his seat before his car made the full transition to the other street. It was always easier when he relaxed. Then he blinked. The air went thick and hot, then thin and cold, electric on his skin with the stink of ozone and helium, all with his eyes shut. When he opened them, no slower than any other blink, the real place was gone, and the other stretched out around him. He'd come through one of the large decorated arches over a 2-lane road in town. He slowed to get his bearings, finding the dress shop, toy store, and the 4-way traffic light ahead. He grinned with a nod and headed forward, weaving through the open streets for his favorite diner. He drove through the permanent shadows of the brick buildings, going slow and checking the doors and windows as he went. Not for people or animals, though. There had never been any of that to bother him, just checking their lintels for the strange symbols emblazoned above. It was habit now, taking inventory in his head of which places could see him home, but it was a strange one, he knew. There was never any worry when he was there, no threat or impending time limit to get back home. There was just an urge to look for the doors as if he were going anywhere else. He found his way to the middle of town, turning right on the roundabout and leaving Town Hall behind with another right turn. He couldn't help but check Town Hall too. Every door, window, stairway, gazebo, and hallway, anything leading into another place was marked above with a symbol. Sometimes there was only one symbol per structure. Others there were several. Some parts of town favored certain symbols over others. Some places didn't even have certain symbols. And as he drove, he found them on every building and structure, even another decorated arch. He kept his mind blank as he passed under it, lest he appear God knows where, the mark, a circle with a vertical line splitting it inside, and emerged on the other side. He took a deep breath and turned the last corner, parking in front of the empty diner and shutting off his car. He sat back, grinning as he opened his door and shook off his suit jacket and tie and threw them into the passenger seat. He undid the first 2 buttons of his shirt as he shut the door and headed for the diner's entrance, eyes flicking to the symbol atop the frame, a triangle, point down, with a small X at each tip. He looked forward, held his breath, and made his mind blank as he took the door and pushed inside. He sighed relieved to be in the diner and not elsewhere, before he rubbed his palms together and headed behind the counter for the perpetually brewing coffee that never ran out and never burnt. He poured a cup and leaned over the counter to watch the breeze rustle through the trees planted every few feet in the sidewalk. He took a deep breath, shutting his eyes at the smell of the dark roast and finishing it at a second before he cleaned it and cleared the diner door for his car. There wasn't much to see or explore in town. It was the same town he came to when he first discovered the other place, and the only place he could picture to get back. But there was a wide world around it. One road going in and out, surrounded by dense forest with mountains on the horizon like something from out west. So, with nothing new to explore and an eternity to kill, he picked a direction and headed for the mountains with the setting sun on his left. If it weren't for that, Alan would never be able to get his bearings out in the wild. Compasses just spun there, and watches and clocks always stopped on the time it had been when he left the reel for the other. The road seemed endless, carving through the forest of trees that Alan had never seen. They weren't alien, per se, but he couldn't place them. Or rather, he recognized too many different trees in them all at once. They grew tall and straight below, with winding branches high above that let in enough sky and sunlight that he could just see the road in front of him. But eventually, he flicked on his headlights and pressed the gas pedal closer and closer to the floor. The road was straight with no branching paths, no signs, no curves, and in the other, he never ran out of gas or thinned his tread, so he smiled like a boy, gripped the wheel hard, and floored the gas with a high howl, the car flying 100, 150, 200 miles an hour. He laughed with the roar of the engine, smile wide and showing all his teeth as he cut through the forest. He couldn't say for how long he raced, there was no real time in the other anyway, but eventually, the forest ended in a blunt, artificial tree line as an 18-lane highway stretched out around him. His eyes went wide, heart falling as his stomach leapt into his mouth. He turned the wheel, foot easing the brake as he arced through the lanes and almost rammed the concrete wall opposite the turn. Just missing a crash, he got the car parallel the wall and eased into a stop. Eyes blown open, heart pounding, fingers and face numb as he remembered to blink when he processed what could have happened. Then he swallowed, shut his mouth, and breathed a chuckle that grew into a laugh and a cackle as he twisted in half to look through all his windows at the huge highway. He pulled forward until he was in the center, the road he took still in sight, and parked the car, leaving it running as he pried his fingers off the wheel to step out and spin around. His mouth came open in a dumb grin as he laughed and whirled. It wasn't an amazing alien structure, no more beautiful or functional than the ones in the reel, but everything that it meant sent chills up his spine. The town was connected to the highway, and if the highway connected to other towns, there could be thousands, millions of other places. He stopped, coughing as something metallic tickled his throat. What if there was a city? Whole skyscrapers full of 10,000 doors and windows that could take him anywhere. Or nowhere. He covered his mouth as the metallic twang filled it and the air went stagnant, heat clinging to his skin until he beaded with sweat. He hacked into his hand, eyes shut with it and couldn't stop as he braced himself on his knees. Blood flew onto his tongue, droplets splattering the clean roadway. His eyes went wide as he stood straight and brought his fingers to his mouth, pulling them away red as he continued to cough. Something rattled in his chest as his eyes darted around and the clear sunset atmosphere rolled over with a sheening fog and clouds. He furrowed his brow and staggered back to his car, gasping and hacking as he went. He fell into the seat and slammed the door, eyes flitting around as he grabbed the wheel and bolted down the highway, planning to turn around for the familiar road and town. But as he drove, the metal and heat slid away with the rolling fog, swimming overhead like time had sped up for everything but him. He furrowed his brows and looked down at his hand, car creeping forward, but the blood was gone. And from his lips, too, the rattle even in his chest was gone. He swallowed, heart racing as he took the wheel and looked around. Everything was back to normal, for the other place, anyway. He looked over his shoulder for the road that he came from, then forward, and to his console. He pulled out the journal stuffed over his gun and flitted to an empty page, bringing the car to a stop as he quickly jotted down the route from town to highway and where the road was to take him back home. Then he tasted metal on the back of his tongue and swallowed, finishing the impromptu map before he looked up at the edges of more fog. He set the journal down and drove forward, pressing down the highway against his better judgment and watching the fog blow away above him, swallowing down the blood. He drove for what felt like hours, maybe even half a day, before he found another road like the one he'd taken to get there. He swallowed and passed it, marking it down before he pressed the gas to the floor and flew, roaring engine echoing across the asphalt, passing 2 more roads before he slowed at the 4th. He coasted for a while, eyeing the turnoff before he looked back the way he'd come, and groaned. His insides twisted, half pulling him back for the familiar town, and the rest scrambling forward to the new road and what might be at the end of it. He looked back and forward a couple of times before he growled at himself and bolted down the new road at full speed so that he couldn't change his mind. It was identical to the one that he'd taken out of town, long, straight, unmarked, and surrounded by alien trees and canopy. So he kept his car at a firm 200 miles an hour, headlights blazing, and the world a blur before he squinted at something in the distance. The tree line didn't end suddenly ahead. It thinned into an open pasture with the sun to his right and another vacant town cropping up on the horizon. He smirked at himself, remembering to jot down a note about keeping moving on the highway as he slowed. But as he neared the other town, he stopped and turned off his headlights. People moved in the streets. He stared, blinking and rubbing his eyes, half hoping they would disappear like a mirage, but the shapes kept moving right where they had been. So he crept forward and shivered as the shapes stopped, turned, and watched him on the road. They came together, pooling in the street and around the buildings, some coming into the roadway, until he parked a few hundred yards off and stepped out, gun in the driver's seat. He held his hand to the side of his face to block the sunset, still squinting as he waved his arm high above his head. The others didn't move, not even to quirk their heads or whisper together, just stared down the road at Alan and his rumbling car. Then one stepped forward, legs moving oddly as they tentatively approached. They stopped and mirrored Alan's position, shoulders rustling with laughter before others joined the first. They were dark, with bright fitted clothes, mostly white and yellow with some streaks of color in the crowd behind. All their heads looked shaved, with long, slender faces, slender everything, really, and a strange buttress that trailed behind them like a second set of legs. Alan stepped closer, squinting, and the others with the stranger all twitched into motion. They set up their arms to wave, but it was awkward, like they'd never thought to even do it before. Alan froze, stiffening as the buttresses behind them moved, bouncing up and down, bending like legs. They moved from foot to foot and shuffled around one another, their arms coming down slowly as they came closer, tilting their tall heads. Then someone from the crowd shouted something in a language Alan didn't recognize. It was guttural, deeper than even that, with sounds that he couldn't imagine how to make. Wet, vibrating sounds deep in their throat, with clicks and strange strings of consonants he knew he couldn't put together even if he tried. He called for them to repeat themselves, thinking they might understand English, but that only made the entire crowd stiffen, then buzz before a disembodied voice raged behind his eyes, bristling him like fever. He reeled back, hands on his head with a gasp as he went taut and stared at the starless sky. "Who are you?" The voice lashed inside his mind. "From where did you come? What's your place of origin?" Alan screamed and crumpled to hand and knee, barely able to see the pack in front of the crowd move forward as all the world doubled and blurred. He whimpered at the searing ache behind his eyes, radiating out until sweat dripped from his brow. He rattled a breath and pushed up against the throb going down his spine now, mouth coming open, numb and lax, as he stumbled around for the car door. He threw himself over the seat and grabbed the gun, checking everything painfully slowly as footsteps came closer and closer. He fell to his haunches, sliding to his hip as he looked up at the 5 creatures rushing toward him. They were tall and slim with oval heads and slit mouths that ran up into their noses. Giant, unblinking eyes bored into him as their 4 toeless feet pounded the asphalt like a spider and horse combined. Their arms, slim and skeletal as the rest of them, were tucked up close to their stomachs like a raptor. Then they opened their mouths, speaking the same strange language as before. Alan lifted his gun with a trembling hand, tears and sweat falling down his face as the burn gripped the inside of his skull. He screamed and fired. One of the creatures yelped like a dog and held the bleeding wound with pincer-like fingers, red staining its sleeveless white uniform. The others all stopped as the wounded one fell to its 4 knees and stared down at the bullet hole, whimpering and careening as it pulled the hands away. The others came close, all staring for a moment, breathing heavy and heavier, until the one on its knees opened its arms with a blank face, and the rest lunged like starving coyotes. The burn was yanked out of Alan's head, pulling him to the ground with the force of it, as he gasped and blinked away the blur, only to scramble up and pull himself into his car as the 4 creatures pulled the 5th apart with their teeth and fingers. Blood, viscera, muscle, and limbs came away, each of them pulling back to thrash their heads back like birds and swallow the shredded flesh whole. He put the car in gear, grabbed the door, and slammed it shut as he hit the gas. The creatures all whirled to face him and screamed. The burn in his head exploded throughout his entire body. He cried out and shut his eyes, gasped to the floor as the car slammed into them and dragged them over the road. The pain suddenly lurched out of him, crashing him into the wheel before he stopped and stared at the blood splattering his hood. Then he looked back, put it in reverse, and growled with bared teeth as he ran the pile of creatures over, and over, and over again. When he looked up from the carnage a few yards in front of his car, the bodies mangled and twitching, his blown eyes fixed on the crowd. His blood went cold, mouth clapping shut with a click of teeth as he gulped and pushed himself hard into the seat. The crowd roared with inhuman voices and charged. Warmth ghosted over his face like he'd stepped just too close to a fire, something scraping his skin like a dull razor before he gasped, flung the car around and bolted back down the road. Time, for what was there, seemed to speed up. He blazed through the forest and onto the highway, skidding left and burning rubber as he lost traction before lurching forward, eyes darting to carefully count the road so that he could get back to town. When he looked back, he wished he hadn't. Wished he could drive the car even faster, as the screeching pack of creatures clamored over and around one another. They ran on 4 feet or dropped onto all 6 limbs and galloped, nearly keeping pace with the car as they flooded the highway. More still poured out of the road to their own town, climbing over one another like a sea of massive fleshy ants. He stomped the gas, despite it doing nothing, and squeezed the wheel, cursing to himself as he counted the turnoffs. Finally, his road opened on the left with the creatures lagging behind. He acted like he'd keep straight just in case they could still see him, then flung himself sideways and blazed down the road through the forest, panting and screaming for his car to go faster. In what seemed like moments, the forest dwindled and opened to pasture and field. The town, his town, rose on the horizon, pulling his lips into a smile. He laughed, low and distant in his own ears, then looked in the rear view. Nothing came out of the forest. A sound left him as he sunk into his seat, something like a whimper and laugh wound up together, then faced forward and shot into the town. He flew down street after street, eyes darting for the archway with the home symbol, 3 vertical lines right of the circle. An arch glistened in the sunset light, decorated white and red like it were for Christmas, and Alan leaned forward, foot cramping from holding the gas, fingers aching and teeth grinding as he held his breath and shot for the way home. He didn't slow down, didn't think to let out his breath or relax either. He'd come out on the side street that no one used. It would be fine. No one would be there. He held the street in his mind as the car passed through the arch, and the air went hot and hotter, bristling his skin before a wave of cool washed over him like water. The air crackled in his ears, stinking of ozone and helium as the image of the town outside the arch blinked into a blurry kaleidoscope. His stomach lurched into his mouth with bile. His eyes bulged in their sockets like he were in vacuum. His chest ached, forcing the air out with a half-screaming breath as he sank deep into his seat, the colors whizzing by until it all crashed together. He flew through the air, the heat, cold, and stink gone, and kept flying. And flying. The car moved with all the momentum that it had before, but the tires weren't touching the ground anymore. The floor moved away beneath him as strange dark shapes came into focus. He blinked and rubbed his tender eyes, squinting and leaning, with furrowed brows, at the strange feeling, almost like he were floating in water. He looked around. He stared. Below him, a wide road carved through an industrial landscape surrounded by wild grass, trees, shrubs, and fungus, all impossibly tall. Buildings sprouted on the horizon, collapsing, broken, or strung up with vines and giant trees. Fog filled the distance as he spun around and stopped, laughing uncomfortably at his tie and jacket that had floated up to the headrest of the passenger seat. He grabbed the tie and waved it in the air, watching it swim like a snake before he let it go. It drifted, slowly moving from the last touch of his fingers. He blinked and his stomach sank. Then he bolted forward, crushing himself over the wheel to stare up at an alien sky. Or something like it. A giant curved wall dominated the horizon to one side, tall enough that a haze of the atmosphere collected into clouds beneath. It stretched out for hundreds of miles, curving up to reveal a flat ring with walls either side and land between. But it wasn't a perfect ring. Whole chunks were broken away and floating in orbit, chunks that passed by his pocket of sky. He stared, skin bristling and guts churning, as the tiniest curve of a planet crested into view with two suns lighting its surface. The arch in town thrust itself behind his eyes and he went rigid, bouncing up into the air from the force of it. His eyes went wide before he looked back and panted, watching a huge metallic archway shrink as the car gently crested up and up. He swallowed, looked around, then grabbed his journal and gun, moving on autopilot. He held both to his chest as he took a deep, careful breath, then gulped the air until his vision blurred, oxygenating his blood in case the air outside was toxic. He took a final deep breath and held it, undoing the seatbelt and casting open the driver door. He carefully pulled himself outside and crawled along the car until he could hold the brake light. Then he awkwardly positioned himself like a frog on the fender, pointed at the ground, and leapt at an angle. Lungs already telling him to breathe and heart racing, he sailed steeply through the air and spread his arms and legs, trying not to turn himself over. When he hit the ground, he'd bounce. That might only see him fly off into the atmosphere, so he readied for impact, covering as much surface area as he could, and slammed into the smooth, flat road. He grunted and lost air, relieving some of the burn in his chest, but he couldn't focus on that. Instead, he shot open his eyes and strained, pushing himself forward with hands and feet so that as he rolled back into the air, he was at least moving closer to the arch. But as he tumbled end over end, the ground seemed to pull him with something like gravity until he coasted over the road halfway there. The tumble had only taken seconds, but half of his air was gone. Every cell screamed for oxygen, so he vomited all his air and scrambled like a lizard, using any tension that he could to pull himself to the arch. Foot by foot he crawled, chest burning, heaving of its own will to make him breathe, but he couldn't let a single breath in for fear that it would kill him. His face twisted in pain, the edges of his vision going hazy as he crouched and leapt the last 10 feet. He spun, hands on his mouth and nose to keep him from breathing in the alien air as he tumbled weightlessly into the arch, the symbol above one that he'd never seen. He pictured the town and shut his eyes as the heat and cold washed over him with the stink of ozone and helium. His stomach jumped into his mouth, nothing to vomit, thankfully, as he rushed forward, gritting his teeth against the pressure squeezing in on him, the rush of 100,000 miles per hour streaking his skin and hair and clothes. His ears popped. Then it all crashed off of him as he skidded onto the ground. His eyes popped open, and he gasped, panting and trembling as he steamed, body hot and the air freezing. He lay there a moment beneath the perpetual sunset, panting as his vision came clear and the pounding in his head started to ease. He rolled onto his side, gasping at the sharp ache rippling from his joints and falling back down. Shaking his head, he braced for it and rolled, pushing up with one arm before he collapsed onto his heels and furrowed his brows at the frost on his sunburnt hands. He winced at the sharp sting in his forehead and felt the skin, hot like he'd been boiled, but flaking with frost. He picked up his journal and gun, both freezing and stiff, and groaned to push himself onto his feet. He carefully breathed through his nostrils as he stretched his back and winced, shaking his head and deciding to go home first. Then he looked around. There were no sounds, no wind, no screeching calls or guttural speech. But he had to be sure. He climbed the steps of a nearby building, careful to keep his mind blank as he passed through each door, not even bothering to check the symbols as he went. Eventually, he broke through the service door to the roof and staggered out, flexing his hands against the setting ache before he stopped near the edge. The horizon was no different than before. Mountains, pasture, forest, and 2 roads going out of town, but the trees were swaying too much for the wind. He swallowed and stayed there, hoping under his breath that it was just the wind. Then the first of those skittering creatures galloped down the road, and another, and 10 and 100. He spun around and made his way down the stairs, trying to collect himself. He was in an apartment building, one near an arch that wasn't to home, so he looked out a window, careful not to touch it, and realized where he was. He spun and bolted down the steps for the elevator doors across from the entrance. There were only 2 doors in that building that took him home, and the elevator was easier than a bathroom window, but it was only on the ground floor. He ran faster than he should have been able to with the ache in his joints, but stumbled just as he reached the 2nd floor, crashing his shoulder into the wall and cursing as he ran for the lobby. He faced the solid double doors, cradling his arm, and spun, running for the elevator and sighing when he saw the familiar symbol for home, for Earth. He pressed the button and turned, eyes fixed on the front doors as his ears strained for the slightest sound. He swallowed, blood racing as his mouth went dry as cotton. Every hair stood on end as he swayed foot to foot, whole body anxious to cast itself through the doors and back home. They might know I'm in this town, he thought, but they won't know which door to use. Not at first, anyway. The doors dinged and opened behind him. He whirled around, holding his house in his mind as he took a deep breath and let it all fall out of him. He stepped forward. The world became color that raced around him as a single echo followed him through. The hollow slide of opening wooden doors. But he couldn't turn to see. The heat came, stinging like sunlight on a burn, and then the cold, numbing him like he were already frozen with the stinking air. Before he could shut his eyes in a blink, the world warped into nothing, then crashed back together as he stepped onto familiar ground. His leg crumpled beneath him, but he caught the doorway of his shed in the backyard. Not quite where he'd aimed, but he was home at least. He sighed and smiled, then swallowed, coughing, doubling over in a fit as blood splattered into the grass. Eventually it stopped, and he could swallow down the metallic sting and wipe his lips clean. He stood and flexed his fingers, looking himself over, skin still lobster red, but the frost was gone at least. He sighed and leaned on the doorway, shutting his eyes and shaking his head, telling himself to ignore the sound that he'd heard as he stepped through. It was nothing, he told himself, just nothing. But the pit in his stomach disagreed. They wouldn't find him for a while, but if just one of those creatures saw him travel in the elevator, they could all come flooding through at any moment. Unless they ate it, like the other one. He chuckled despite himself and leaned his temple on the frame of the door. He couldn't take that chance. But what could he do? Then he walked forward and faced his shed door, gun at the ready. He stood there for moments, minutes, and nothing came through. Still, he couldn't shake the cold worming out of the pit in his stomach. He looked at his house over his shoulder and sighed, his brother's face blooming in the back of his head, his father's, Marjorie's. He shuddered at the random thought of her being torn apart by those things, her lovely face, her favorite sundress ripped and bloody, her gentle but strong hands tossed aside as the rest of her was butchered amid her gurgling screams. Alan shook his head and turned, headed for the back door as he thought, I can't do anything on my own. It's time I tell someone else about all this, whether I sound crazy or not.